The Albanese government is this morning announcing $95 million in support for Ukraine and further sanctions on Russia.
There's a country that has now committed over $1.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine. A country that loaded 60-ton tanks onto a cargo ship and sailed them halfway around the world. A country that flew its most advanced surveillance aircraft into Polish airspace to protect the supply lines keeping Ukraine alive, and got scrambled on live NATO missions over 45 times. That country is not the United States. It's not Germany, France, or the United Kingdom. It's Australia. And here's what makes this uncomfortable for everyone who isn't Australia. While Washington stalled, while Europe debated, a country that last fought in Europe during the Second World War quietly handed Ukraine 49 tanks, the kind that weigh 60 tons and require a month and a half at sea to deliver. Then Australia ran live combat air missions out of Poland. Then sanctioned Russia's ghost ships, lowered the oil price cap, sanctioned the crypto networks, quietly, methodically, every time. Moscow didn't see it coming. Neither did Washington. The whole thing happened in plain sight. Almost nobody covered it. And the most awkward part, America tried to stop them. Here's the part that matters. Australia is not in NATO. It has no legal obligation to arm Ukraine. It shares no land border with Russia. The nearest Russian military installation is roughly 7,000 kilometers from Darwin. Honestly, Canberra could have issued strongly worded diplomatic statements, donated some humanitarian supplies, and called it a day. Instead, Australia became the largest non-NATO contributor of military assistance to Ukraine in this war. That title isn't ceremonial. It means Australia, population 27 million, no shared border, no direct threat, has outspent or out-equipped every non-member country in terms of military support. And this isn't charity, it's strategy. Because Canberra has been watching something closely. The way wars in Europe have a habit of reshaping the rules of the Indo-Pacific. If Russia can carve up a sovereign democracy without consequence, that's not just a European problem. That's a precedent, one that a certain large neighbor to Australia's north has been studying very carefully. So when Prime Minister Albanese and his defense team put out a joint statement in February 2026 escalating pressure on Russia, they weren't grandstanding. They meant it, and they didn't wait for Washington's permission. On February 24th, 2026, the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, Australia announced its single largest sanctions package since the war began. 180 individuals, entities, and vessels in one hit. These weren't symbolic listings.
Before Russia took these deplorable steps, Australia had already imposed autonomous sanctions against Russia, targeting both individuals and entities for undermining Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The targets span Russia's finance and banking sector, its defense industry, aeronautics, oil and gas, transportation, and science and technology. The goal is surgical: cut off the money flows that keep the war machine running, and make it painful enough for the people enabling it that they start thinking twice. But the part that got less attention than it deserved was the cryptocurrency angle. For the first time, Australia sanctioned cryptocurrency entities specifically being used to run cross-border payments that bypass Western sanctions. Russia and its enablers had quietly built an alternative financial plumbing system using crypto, and Australia just started blocking the pipes. Then came the oil price cap. Australia lowered its cap on Russian crude from $47.60 per barrel down to $44.10. That might sound like a rounding error, but multiply it by millions of barrels and you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in reduced revenue per year. Every dollar Russia doesn't earn on oil is a dollar that doesn't go toward drones, missiles, or soldier pay. Australia has now imposed more than 1,800 individual sanctions in response to Russia's invasion. That didn't happen overnight. It's the result of a consistent, deliberate escalation over 4 years, targeted not at optics, but at outcomes. To put that in perspective, Russia's entire population of publicly available oligarchs is running out of people to sanction. Australia is working on the extended cast. And here's something worth noting. Direct Australian imports of Russian energy products have fallen from $80 million before the invasion to exactly zero, not reduced, zero. Australia didn't just sanction Russia. It walked away from Russian energy entirely. But sanctions on paper are only as good as your ability to enforce them. Russia found a workaround. Australia found it first. Russia's ghost navy is one of the most underreported dimensions of this entire war, and Australia has been right in the middle of it. Russia's shadow fleet is a network of aging tankers, hundreds of them, that operate under deceptive flags and sail without legitimate insurance. Their job is simple: move Russian oil to buyers who don't care about Western sanctions and keep the money flowing back to Moscow. It's a floating sanctions evasion operation, and it's been working better than it should. The ships disable their tracking systems, change flags mid-voyage, and carry insurance that wouldn't cover a rowboat. If this sounds like a criminal operation dressed up in maritime law, that's because it is. Australia first sanctioned shadow fleet vessels in June 2025. 60 ships in one package, the first time Canberra had ever directly targeted the fleet. The February 2026 package came back even harder. The shadow fleet ships operate through a combination of flag hopping, falsified documentation, and opaque ownership chains. The February package went after the financial and logistical infrastructure behind those ships. Not just the vessels themselves, but the companies, individuals, and payment systems that keep the oil moving and the money clean. When Australia sanctions a shadow fleet vessel, it doesn't just stop that one ship. It makes the entire network of services that vessel relied on, insurance, port access, financing, harder to obtain. Over time, that drives up the cost and risk of operating the fleet, which squeezes Russia's oil revenues from a different angle than the price cap alone. It's not dramatic. It's not a missile strike, but it's the kind of pressure that compounds, and Russia can't sanction its way out of it. But while all of this was happening with the sanctions and the ghost ships, Australia was also flying, literally. This next part barely made the news outside of defense circles, but it's arguably the most operationally significant thing Australia did. In August 2025, at the request of NATO and Poland, Australia deployed an RAAF 7A Wedgetail aircraft to Europe. Under Operation Kudu, up to 100 ADF personnel deployed alongside it, based in Poland, flying missions to protect the supply routes keeping weapons flowing into Ukraine. The E-7A Wedgetail is Australia's airborne early warning aircraft, the one that watches the sky so other aircraft don't have to. On a standard mission, it covers an area roughly half the size of Europe. It sees things before they become problems. NATO tasked it specifically with protecting the logistics hubs, the physical choke points where Western aid enters Ukraine. If those supply lines get disrupted, if Russia figures out where the aid is coming from and when, the whole support network starts to crack. The Wedgetail's job was to make sure that didn't happen. And it flew a lot. By the time it left Europe in late 2025, the Wedgetail had flown more than 45 operational missions, many of them scrambles, called in live, to manage air battle situations in real time. ABC News reported in May 2026 that one of those missions had provided critical intelligence to NATO during Russian air activity near Estonia. That's not a training exercise. That's a shooting war mission conducted by Australian crew flying an Australian aircraft over European airspace. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte specifically praised Australia's contribution, saying the relationship with Australia and the other Indo-Pacific partners is one NATO values deeply, and that Australia showing up like this, repeatedly at range, is exactly the kind of partnership NATO needs more of. Wing Commander Sam Thorpe commanded the mission. His crew, Australian men and women, some on their first overseas deployment, flew alongside NATO's finest and came home knowing they'd done something that mattered. This is the part of the story where things get complicated. Australia's decision to send Ukraine 49 M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks was not straightforward. There was resistance, specifically from Washington. Here's the background. The M1A1 is an American-designed tank, and the US has always kept a say in where its exported hardware ends up. When Australia decided to send its entire decommissioned M1A1 fleet to Ukraine, the Trump administration reportedly did not grant clearance quickly. The same posture that froze direct US aid to Ukraine appears to have slowed Australian tank transfers too. Canberra kept the pressure on. The clearance eventually came. and the tanks shipped. There's something almost Australian about that. The Americans said no. Australia said, yeah, nah, and shipped the tanks. The tanks were all decommissioned. Australia was already upgrading to the newer M1A2 anyway. They were modified for Ukrainian requirements, loaded onto a cargo ship in Geelong, and began a 55-day sea journey. Australian tank crewmen accompanied them. They arrived in Europe, spent about a week getting the tanks battle-ready, and were handed to the armed forces of Ukraine. The first 37 arrived in July 2025. The final 12 were delivered in December 2025. The total package is valued at approximately 245 million Australian dollars, around 160 million US dollars. Australia had done what Washington had hesitated to do. Ukraine didn't just park those tanks. Within weeks of the final deliveries, they were being modified, crewed, and sent to the front. The 425th Separate Assault Regiment, known as Skelia, received the Australian Abrams. The crews immediately set about adapting the tanks to a battlefield that would kill anything not designed for it. They added FPV drone protection netting, the turtle overhead cage system that's become standard on Ukrainian armor. They fitted Contact 1 explosive reactive armor blocks to the turret and sides. They applied forest camouflage. And they Ukrainianized the internal control panels and displays, replacing the English language systems with Ukrainian labels, so crews who don't speak English could operate the tanks faster in combat. That last detail tells you something important. Ukraine is not a passive recipient of Western equipment. It's an active modifier and adapter. The Australian Abrams that rolled into eastern Ukraine were not the same machines that left Geelong. They were Ukrainian fighting vehicles that happened to have an Abrams as their starting point. The Ukrainians, for their part, were probably not sentimental about the Auscam paint job, and they fought. In early January 2026, Ukrainian military bloggers first reported the tanks being used in defensive operations around Pokrovsk, the same city that's been one of the most brutal grinding points of the entire war. Then, in March 2026, war correspondent David Axe reported on what the 1st Assault Regiment, a separate unit that had also received ex-Australian Abrams, was doing with theirs. By then, the 1st Assault Regiment had solved the turtle tank problem, the cage design that protected against drones but prevented the turret from rotating to fire. Their ex-Australian Abrams were rolling on Russian infantry in Zaporizhia and using their main guns. That's what a tank is supposed to do. Canberra sent 49 tanks. Ukraine turned them into weapons. Here's what makes all of this stranger than it looks. $1.7 billion in total assistance. $1.5 billion of that is military. That's the bill Australia has chosen to pay for a war being fought on the other side of the planet against a country that poses no direct conventional threat to Australian soil. This is not naivety. This is calculation. Australia's defense planners have been watching Beijing for years. China's buildup, its posture around Taiwan, its documented support for Russia's war. NATO's own leadership called China a decisive enabler of the invasion. That language wasn't diplomatic filler. It was a warning, and Canberra heard it. China, for its part, has described NATO's engagement with Australia as fomenting chaos, which is exactly what you'd say if someone was successfully disrupting your plans. If a great power can erase a sovereign democracy and face no meaningful consequence, that's not a European problem. That's a precedent that travels. The people who need to believe in the rules-based order the most are the ones in the smaller democracies closest to countries with large militaries and bigger appetites. And so the investment in Ukraine is, in part, an investment in the idea that the rules still matter, that borders can't be redrawn by force without cost, that the world's democracies will still show up when it counts. The Wedgetail didn't have to fly. The tanks didn't have to ship. The sanctions didn't have to be the biggest in 4 years, but they were. The sanctions keep expanding. The crypto networks are now a target. The oil price cap just got cut again. None of that is slowing down. The Wedgetail is home now, but it proved something important. Australia can deploy its most advanced surveillance aircraft into a live operational environment in Europe, integrate with NATO command structures, fly real missions, and get it back. That's not a capability Australia had demonstrated at scale before. Now it has. Australia also became the first non-NATO nation, alongside New Zealand, to contribute to NATO's coordinated Ukraine equipment list, not sending aid around NATO inside it. $50 million worth of exactly what Ukraine said it needed most. Russia spent 4 years assuming its war in Ukraine would be contained to Europe, that the countries without a direct stake, the ones too far away, too small, or too distracted, would eventually tune out. Australia has been the most consistent argument against that assumption. It sent tanks when Washington delayed. It flew surveillance missions NATO needed. It sanctioned the shadow fleet, the crypto networks, the banks, the oligarchs. It cut Russian energy imports to zero, then kept cutting the oil price cap. None of it made headlines the way a single American policy announcement would. None of it moved markets, but all of it moved the war. And here's what Moscow doesn't want to admit. Australia is not going to stop. The logic that drove Canberra into this fight, that what happens in Europe shapes what's possible in the Indo-Pacific, isn't going to change based on how the war ends. If anything, the precedent set in the next 12 months will make everything Australia has done here look either like the smartest investment a middle power ever made, or the opening move of something much bigger. 9,000 miles from the nearest Russian missile, and right in the middle of this war.